Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Landon Mitchell Show. I'm your host, Landon Mitchell. I'm a socialist, political commentator, and now podcast host looking to provide interesting socialist takes on society. Today, I'm here with a distinguished guest, Professor Matt McManus. Professor McManus, please introduce yourself to the podcast.
Sure, it's great to be here. My name is Matt, like you mentioned. I'm a lecturer in political science at the University of Michigan, and I've been writing about socialist and left politics for a very long time now. My most recent book was The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism, which people can check out if they want.
Thank you. And that book was published by Routledge, I believe, which is a very prestigious publication in academia. And I'm just wondering, Professor McManus, what inspired you to write this book?
Sure. Well, there are a few different reasons. The big one, of course, was just intellectual, right? I thought that the tradition of liberal socialism was an intriguing tradition that a lot of people didn't know very much about, and it was worth reintroducing it to a broader audience. And hopefully, that's what things like this podcast will do. But the bigger and more important reasons were, of course, starting in 2016, many illiberal right forces gained an enormous amount of ground around the globe. And I don't need to tell you in 2025 that we're still very much in the midst of this turn. And what really came to the fore when I studied a lot of right-wing philosophers, which is what I kind of do as my second stream of interest, was how much many on the right emphasized that there was this deep elective affinity between liberalism and socialism, and they rejected them both, of course. And of course, there's a kind of vulgar iteration of this argument you can see on Twitter, for example, where anyone to basically the left of Ronald Reagan is, a Marxist, a Maoist, a communist, a socialist, a lib, all that kind of stuff. But there's a deeper version of this argument, too, that you can find in the writings of people like Nietzsche, Heidegger, Denis, whom all will point out that liberalism and socialism are just both quintessentially egalitarian modernist doctrines that emerged, in their mature form at least, out of the Enlightenment. And consequently, anybody who identifies with the right needs to reject both of them for very similar kinds of reasons. So studying the right really made me aware of these symmetries between liberalism and socialism. And I guess the last reason, and then I'll shut up for a second, is, I spent a lot of time talking to my fellow comrades on the left, being very interested in the liberal tradition, thinking that there's a lot of value to it. And plenty of people, quite understandably, will say things like, you can't trust normie libs, socialism is very different than liberalism. Look at the Democratic Party, very frequent response I get. And look, I sympathize with an awful lot of that. I want to be very clear about that, right? Normally, liberalism has a lot to answer for. But I would always kind of press a little bit further and say, okay, well, do you really think that socialism or any kind of left radical project is going to involve rejecting things like freedom of religion, freedom of association, freedom of speech, the right to vote, all these kinds of things? And invariably, people would say, no, of course not, right? If anything, those will be safer with us than they will with normie libs. We'll trade them off whenever capitalism demands it. And I said, okay, well, then it sounds to me like we are all committed to certain basic and recognizably liberal norms. And the important thing to do is to try to make explicit why it is that all of us on the left and within liberalism are committed to those norms. And that was part of what my book was trying to do.
Right. And just real quick, could you kind of describe what the reaction on Twitter was like when you began speaking up about liberal socialism?
Sure. It was actually kind of funny. I mentioned this in the preface to the book, which I don't normally do, right? It's a little bit narcissistic for an author to talk about, the reception to a book that he hasn't even written yet. But, I said, I'm going to write this book on liberal socialism. Really excited about it. Should be interesting. And I got just hundreds of reactions, way, way more than what I normally get, right? And they kind of fell within two categories. One, there were people who were just outraged that I was arguing for something or retrieving something like liberal socialism. And oddly enough, there were a mix of different ideological positions that were hostile to this. Probably the two most prominent, you don't normally see these people sharing space together, where there were kind of normie neo-libs, center-right liberals, people with a lot of Hayek imagery on their profiles were like, absolutely not. No such thing as liberal socialism. Being a liberal means supporting unbridled capitalism. And then ironically, they were paired with a lot of tankies, people who have a lot of Trotsky and Mao symbology on their profiles. And they were also like, liberalism means capitalism, nothing to do with that. But then the second group of people were those who were intrigued, sometimes skeptical. But I got a lot of people who would say to me things like, I've always thought that there was some connection between these two doctrines, or, I'm a socialist, but I also believe in, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, all that kind of other stuff. So I'm curious to see what you have to say about this. So I thought that clearly, given there was a polarized reaction to this, there'd be some interest in the book, and so far that seems to have been borne out.
Right, and I think it's worth mentioning, especially in regards to your you talking about how the normie liberals or the classical liberals kind of allied with the tankies against you, and just as you mentioned that there was this right wing shift towards the liberalism, I think among the left there has been an increased prominence in left wing illiberalism as well. For example, Black nationalism has had a bit of a resurgence. We hear more Black nationalist rhetoric, I think, in our political discourse, especially throughout the 2010s. And I think with the failure, or I would maybe not failure, but with the two defeats that Bernie Sanders' campaigns experienced in 2016 and 2020, a lot of leftists turned to Marxism, Leninism, became tankies, and that's of course a very illiberal ideology. So I think we also see a shift towards illiberalism on the left and the right at the same time. So it's almost like a war on two fronts, or maybe even three, once you consider the normie liberals, the classical liberals too. So I guess what I'm getting to now is why do you think there's this historical antagonism between leftists and liberals?
Well, I think for a lot of the reasons that various Marxists have diagnosed, right? For a very long period of time, for historical and normative reasons, many people who identified as liberals saw themselves as defending market society or capitalism, whichever you prefer, and doing so in a pretty unbridled way. A good expression of this would be in the writings of Ludwig von Mises, the famous Austrian economist, who's kind of the villain of my liberal socialism book. In his liberalism book, von Mises basically just outright says, to be a liberal means to be committed to private property, that is, private ownership of the means of production. All the other demands of liberalism flow from this central demand. And many Marxists would say that's absolutely correct. They just wouldn't give it the kind of positive connotation that von Mises does. But what I point out in the book is that it's reductive to claim that liberalism has always been a unconscious or unreflective, or liberals have always been unconscious and unreflective proponents of market society. Many of them, going back quite far, were very critical of the excesses of capitalism. And of course, in my book, I'm talking about an important stream of liberal thinkers who actually came to the belief that to be a liberal meant that you couldn't support capitalism in any way, shape, or form. And these aren't minor idiosyncratic figures either. What I point out is that actually the two greatest liberal thinkers in 2 centuries, John Stuart Mill and John Rawls, either identified as socialists in the case of John Stuart Mill and said that socialists were the more far-sighted successors of liberals, or were extremely, extremely sympathetic to what he called liberal socialism in the case of John Rawls. So I think that rather than adopting this extremely bifurcated, and I'd like to stress also undialectical view of ideologies, as unremittingly committed to certain kinds of positions, the way that some Marxists think that liberalism just means you have to be committed to defending capitalism. We should adopt a more expansive, historically textured view and recognize that when they get out in the wild, ideologies can take on all kinds of interesting forms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And it's often, I think you point this out in the book, it's a bit ironic when Marxists turn to somebody like Ludwig von Mises, who is, in my opinion, probably like I guess you could call the worst libertarian out of all of them, in order to attack liberal socialism. And I think it's also interesting that there is a distinction between private property and the property of the ruling class, the capitalist class, right? Like, because I mean, what socialism calls for is not necessarily the abolition of private property per se. It calls for the abolition of the capitalist class's control over private property. And so I feel like as if the liberalism's protection of private property is not necessarily tied to defending capitalism, although obviously in many of its historical instantiations, that has been the case, right?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a long chapter on Marx and Marxism in the book. And important Marxists appear elsewhere as well. Cedric Robinson, the great Black Marxist, is a good example of that. But one of the things that I point out is that Marx and Engels make some extremely sharp critiques of the most vulgar forms of bourgeois ideology on exactly this point. A good example is very early on, Marx and Engels point out that there's a deep irony in bourgeois theorists proclaiming that private property is essential for freedom, and then creating a capitalist society where most people don't own any private property, except for their labor, if you want to even consider that, which means, of course, that nobody is actually free by their own kind of standards, right? And what they pointed out in a very imminent way was that within communism, if possession of property meant freedom, when everybody owned property together, that means that people would, of course, be more free. But what I point out in the book also, and I want to be very clear about this, is Marx is a much more subtle critic of liberalism than he's sometimes taken to be. Right? There's this kind of crude, very online attitude which holds that Marx is just the negation of liberalism, which, as I stress, is a very undialectical approach. Marx and Engels were both emphatic about over the fact that bourgeois ideology was the kind of highest ideology and the highest social form that had emerged thus far. And in his critique of the Gotha program, he actually reprimands the utopian socialists for believing that there can be this millenarian break with bourgeois right, is the terminology, or bourgeois right. He says, look, that is ahistorical, even idealist in its kind of orientation. Any new socialist society that emerges from bourgeois society is going to be stamped with many features of bourgeois society, including many features of bourgeois right, bourgeois institutions, the bourgeois state, et cetera, et cetera. So that is not to say that Marx was a liberal socialist avant la lettre or something. I want to be very, very overt about that. It's just to say that this kind of antagonistic approach that many Marxists takes towards liberalism, where they're just unremittingly critical of it, is not what the master himself felt about any important point.
Right. Exactly. And I think maybe leftists are seeing the liberal commitment to the rule of law, and they're seeing that our current legal system protects the property of the capitalist class. Like, for example, if we did it like the 1950s and the auto workers locked themselves inside of a Stellantis factory and refused to leave, well, our current liberal system would say, hey, you're trespassing, and law enforcement would get involved and remove them. And so I think from that perspective, they're seeing liberalism as contradictory to the kind of, workers' action that we need to accomplish socialism. But because, if you respect the rule of law, then you have to respect the property of the capitalist class. But I think the problem with that argument is it's well defined, and maybe you could build this out more for me. It seems to me that it's well defined in the liberal tradition that it's okay to violate the law in order for the rule of law to take place. Like, that's what Martin Luther King did, right? Like, the desegregation was the law, but in the South, segregation still existed. And so he broke the law in order to force people to follow the law. So, like, would not the same logic apply to socialism and liberalism? Like, wouldn't we just say, well, this is an unjust social relation. We have every right to. It almost goes back to, like, say, Emmanuel Saez, the great theorist of the French Revolution. He said that the elites are so powerful, it's almost as if they have their own nation and their own set of laws. And so under those circumstances, like, is there not like a great liberal tradition that says you can absolutely violate the rule of law?
Yeah, without a doubt. And I mean, I want to stress, Marx and Engels were emphatic about that as well, right? I mean, they pointed out that the bourgeois social form and the bourgeois class was the most revolutionary the world has ever seen. A very good book on exactly the story that you're telling very eloquently is Samuel Moyn's The Lost History of Liberalism, which is a huge influence on my own work. And honestly, people should skip my book and go read Sam's book instead if they get a chance. But one of the things that Sam points out following Marx is that there's no doubt that when liberalism came into the world, it was a radically progressive revolutionary creed, right? Helped inspire the French Revolution, American Revolution, Haitian revolutions, and of course many of the other revolutions in 1848 that Marx and Engels themselves welcomed so enthusiastically. But he points out that there have always also been conservative undercurrents to the liberal tradition that often align with this fetishism of property. And these really came to the fore during the Cold War and the formation of what Moyn calls Cold War liberalism. This is where you start to see liberal thinkers like Hayek, Isaiah Berlin in some periods, of course, Milton Friedman, all started to internalize very conservative arguments about the importance of law and order, protection of private property without any kind of qualification, and insist that this was what was essential to the liberal tradition. Now, I'm going to myself point out that this isn't some kind of aberration of liberalism. There have always been instincts in this direction that made some liberals very ripe for these modes of argumentation. And they became very successful, not least because they adhered to what the capitalist ruling class wanted. But it's not exhaustive of what liberals have thought, right? As you point out, many liberals down to the current era have been very supportive of the importance of things like civil disobedience, even an agonistic kind of politics. And obviously, left liberals and liberal socialists have been especially sympathetic to the importance of civil disobedience. And for that matter, they've also recognized very prominently the way that an excess of weight being placed on private property can be distortive of things like respect for liberal rights and respect for democracy.
Yeah, and so let's say, for the sake of the argument, that it's, as you suggest, theoretically coherent to be liberal socialist. Why should we be liberal socialist?
Well, my book is not a defense of liberal socialism. This is kind of an academic dispute, so I'll get through it very quickly. My book is a retrieval of liberal socialism. So a retrieval is a term coined by the great Canadian political philosopher and socialist, C.B. McPherson. McPherson referred to retrieval as essentially recovering a stream of a tradition that we thought we know, and recognizing that it had emancipatory and egalitarian and indeed radical dimensions that had been underappreciated, which is exactly what McPherson himself did with regard to the liberal tradition. But, much like McPherson didn't defend his own version of liberal socialism, if people read my book looking for my own kind of defense of what liberal socialism would look like, they're not going to get it. For me, any kind of liberal socialism has to be a lot more Marxist than it historically has been, because I think there are a lot of insights there. But just to kind of riff, I do think that there are good reasons to take seriously liberal socialism right now. Just to give two of them, I think that leftists, to my point, have a lot of good reasons to take seriously things like freedom of assembly, especially freedom of speech now. When you think of what the Trump administration is doing, the right to vote, freedom of religion, tolerance for difference, all those kinds of things, especially as they're under attack by the right, need to be cherished and defended by the left, not only for principled reasons, but also for strategic ones, because a lot of people are deeply concerned about the threat posed to these four values, and they'll be receptive to anyone who defends them. But the second reason I think that liberal socialism deserves a shot is that any kind of radical transformation that takes place in society isn't going to be any kind of millenarian break, as far as I'm concerned. And I think that this is a mistake that some socialists sometimes play into. There's this kind of idea that after the revolution, everything is going to be changed. We're going to year one it. Well, as I point out, it's a very un-Marxist and very unhistorical approach to take. I think we need to recognize that any new society we create is going to be stamped by many features of the old. And the kind of imminent point about this is when you're trying to engage in counter-hegemonic activities, sitting there and trying to insist to ordinary people that we're going to radically transform society and everything will be different is not going to be something that they're going to be very receptive to. Instead, what you need to do is convince people that the best expression of the principles that they themselves already claim to be beholden to, in this case, liberal principles, demands a commitment to socialism. And I think that if we look at the American population, many people are extremely receptive to that. You pointed out Bernie Sanders before, and without a doubt, his first two campaigns failed. But look at the enormous support right now for his anti-oligarchy tour, right? He's running with AOC. I went to his rally in Detroit, and there was an overflow room for the overflow room. And one of the reasons why Sanders was appealing was he didn't sit there and say, tomorrow everything will be changed if people like me are elected. What he said instead was the fundamental values of American democracy are under threat from oligarchy, which is absolutely true. And if we're going to protect those fundamental values, we need to attack the biggest threat to it, which is oligarchy. And the crowd went wild because they understood this, right? This kind of imminent form of rhetorical argumentation, to be fancier than Sanders himself would be, I think is the way to get people on board with a socialist project and engage in a counter-hegemonic insurgence against the rising reactionary tide. And indeed, I think that's the only way that successful revolutions have ever been carried out that are comprehensive enough to truly be historical change that lasts.
Right. And I think what people are seeing is that these current social inequalities that the oligarchy has created are the result of morally arbitrary circumstances. And
Oh
you
yeah.
talk a lot about those in your book. For example, I think that health insurance agencies are a good example of this, right? Like once a year, Americans have to choose between numerous healthcare plans. You've got the Anthem Sierra EPO, the Kaiser Permanente HMO, the bronze,
Mhm.
silver, gold, whatever it is. And you just basically have to hope that you're lucky enough to not have to go to a doctor if you choose a high deductible plan. And it seems like it's more of a matter of like luck than merit, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you can, without a doubt, express this in Rawlsian terms. We can get into that for a second. But just to kind of riff on the healthcare point, poll after poll after poll after poll has shown that most Americans are enormously frustrated by the current state of the American healthcare system. Uh, and there's enormous appetite to change it. Um, Aligned with that, most Americans, poll after poll after poll, show us think that the government has a responsibility to ensure that everyone gets health, not just some, everybody, right? And yet nothing has been done meaningfully on this for decades, right? Yeah, you can maybe point to Obamacare, but we all know how much of a compromise that was. And the reason why nothing has been done, despite the fact that there's an enormous amount of Democratic support for this, is because very clearly the health industry does not want anything to be done because there's an enormous amount of profit to be made over the the healthcare system the way that it currently is. And coming from Canada, right? I can say that I was personally shocked when I moved here about how expensive everything is. I get health
Yeah.
insurance from my employer, and I'm grateful for that, right? But we're shelling out $6,000 a year, maybe more, right, for healthcare that is inferior to anything you'd get in Canada, where the public healthcare system isn't even, that impressive compared to some of the others that exist in the world, other public healthcare systems, right? Uh, so I can tell you that it's a night and day, right? And something very serious needs to be done about that immediately, right? Because it is not a sustainable situation.
Right. And I mean, even with employer provided health insurance, I mean, we're still talking about subsidizing greed, right? Because with a profit driven system, shareholders are going to try to make as much money as possible. And even if, you know, if you don't have to pay for it, somebody is, and people are getting rich off of that, right?
Mhm. Yeah, that's
And
exactly right.
yeah, so one of the things that I noticed in reading a lot of the reactions to your book is that some observers are concerned that liberal socialism isn't socialism at all. And I feel like at the highest level of abstraction, it seems to me that socialism refers to social ownership over the means of production, whether it's state ownership, workers' cooperatives, or a fusion of the two. In your book, you mentioned that the liberal socialist J.S. Mill allowed for highly unionized private enterprises that weren't necessarily worker owned. So do you think like liberal socialism leaves any space for the capitalist class to exist? Like how do we distinguish it from Ryan capitalism or the Nordic model?
So I think that what Mill, Rawls, and the others are talking about is a system where there will be markets, right? Although they insist that markets aren't intrinsic to capitalism, right? Markets have existed as long as human societies have existed. Capitalism is a very recent phenomenon, right?
Right.
What they argue for is that by and large, the capitalist class does not provide very much in terms of value. Mill, especially, was notably emphatic about this, where he said, yeah, capitalists provide a little bit of technical know how and managerial experience, but nothing that workers can't provide for themselves, right? Rawls has less overtly to say about this, but he also supports a more or less even distribution of property and worker management of firms. So the way that they kind of envision society existing is, of course, personal property would continue to exist, and I think that that just has to be a given in any socialist society, right? However much you're concerned about the fetish many people make of property, and I agree that it is a fetish. Nobody wants, your home or your car, your laptop to be collectively owned, right? There's some things that we want for ourselves, and I think that that's an entirely correct human instinct. And worker-owned firms might be complicated by small-scale privately owned businesses, but after a certain scale, where private ownership of the means of production becomes aligned with capacity to enact systems of domination, whether politically or economically, any liberal socialist would say there are good reasons to offset that. using various different mechanisms. And I think that in terms of when this threshold is reached, it's not a question that you can really answer theoretically. It's something that has to be examined given material and historical context. And this, of course, draws inspiration from things like the Nordic model, but goes well beyond it, right? If you want a kind of example in Swedish history that kind of points in the direction of where I think liberal socialism would go, in the 1970s, during the most radical period of Nordic social democracy, when Olof Palme was in power in Sweden and the head of the Swedish Social Democrats, the Meidner Plan was proposed that would essentially make workers the primary or even exclusive owners of the firms that they worked at, through giving them shares in the companies they worked at that would be managed by labor unions over a period of time. So eventually they become 50% owners in the companies. Capital launched a massive pushback against this because while they were quite comfortable with high levels of taxation and even some regulation in the economy throughout the heyday of Nordic social democracy, workers owning the firms that they worked at, that was just a bridge too far. And they were successful, unfortunately, in blunting that experiment. I think a liberal socialist society would try to do something that looks very much like that. And you can call that a form of market socialism if you'd like.
Yeah, and also, unfortunately, in Sweden, the ruling class succeeded in rolling back so many of the socialist measures in the 1980s. So I was wondering, there's an interesting quote in or an interesting reference in your book. You reference Thomas Paine's Common Sense, and he writes, "The state of a king shuts him from the world, yet the business of a king requires him to know it thoroughly." And I think we can maybe draw an interesting connection from that to the idea of capitalism itself, because it's the workers who have the information about the day-to-day interactions of the workplace. Like, I remember when I worked at a warehouse, the boss would come around and he'd say, "Do this and do that," and the workers would nod along. And then as soon as he left, they would do whatever they wanted, and the boss really didn't even know the difference. And so I think, do you think that there's a parallel between Paine's critique of monarchy and the idea of capitalism?
Yeah, without a doubt, right? So I do think that there is no doubt that our current ruling class is extraordinarily distanced from the material conditions that most people face, which means that they are not particularly well equipped to manage society, and they're definitely not very well equipped to empathize with the needs of working people. I mean, think about Donald Trump, right? Yeah, he can stand as somebody who worked at a McDonald's, during the middle of a campaign, but the government has recently committed to $800 billion worth of cuts to Medicare. It's rolling back, government unions, and of course, just rock the economy with a very stupidly advised trade war that's probably going to enact a recession that's going to have calamitous effects for the most economically vulnerable. And he doesn't care because, from his perspective, a lot of his rich buddies made a lot of money on the stock market. But I think that we have to be clear as socialists, right, that the problem isn't necessarily the composition of the ruling class or even the fact that they are capitalists per se. Just to give one example, right? When I was working at a grocery store, for about 7 years, we had someone come in once asking if we wanted to unionize. And boy, oh boy, did they show him the door quick, right? And then the boss came down, and he was a nice guy. He had worked in the same in Loblaws before, became manager, by working hard and having some expertise. And he said, "Look, I understand that people are frustrated with what's going on here, and I wish I could treat you all better and give you more money and all that stuff. But the reality is, they open a farm boy just down the street, and if we pay any more, then we're going to get eaten alive." And I think that he meant it, right? This wasn't some kind of glib, just stop, get back into your place, peasants, got an attitude. He was really concerned about the competition that he was facing. And this is a point Soren Mao makes in his really fantastic book on mute compulsion, which is the best update of Marx's theory of economic power, where he points out, look, you can have nice capitalists out there that may very well want to treat people better. You can even have very knowledgeable capitalists that are genuinely committed to social reforms to improve the lot of the working class. But as long as you have an economic system that imposes upon everyone the requirement to put the needs of capital and capitalism ahead of ordinary people, it's never going to be sustainable. Because, you might get the odd capitalist who wants to enact reforms, but then his business is going to go under, everyone else is going to outcompete him, and we're just going to return to what did Mars call it? The old filthy business again, right? So I think that we need to moralize, yes, and also recognize that oligarchs are a problem, but never fail to acknowledge that the problem isn't necessarily this person or that person or getting the right politician in charge. It's the systemic nature of this extraordinary alienating social form, capitalist mode of production that we're up against. That's the major problem.
Yeah, and I think it's pretty clear that we're gonna have a hard time getting these social democratic reforms with a capitalist class in place because, I mean, to some extent, there is a mutually beneficial agreement we can make with the capitalist class in the sense that, for example, if they raise wages, sure, there'll be some increase in productivity. But at the end of the day, most of the demands that we are making of the capitalist class are going to come out of their pockets. Most of it is not going to be mutually beneficial. It's going to be zero sum. It's either we win or they win. And I think the idea that we have to remove the ruling class to really get what we want, it's true. We can't just settle for Rhine capitalism or Nordic model economics because we're not going to be able to get everything we want that way.
Yeah, absolutely. So Corey Robin wrote a very good book called The Reactionary Mind about the political right. And I'll complement what he said with Wendy Brown's really fantastic analysis of neoliberalism in her book, In the Ruins of Neoliberalism. And what both authors point out is that many people on the left have a hard time understanding why people on the right, including capitalists, so often see themselves as victims, right? Especially when they're extraordinarily affluent, extraordinarily privileged, etc. And there are many people who are really victimized, including by them, in the world. But what the authors point out, and this is very true, is that in a certain sense, capitalists do feel like they're being victimized, and they do feel like they're threatened. Why? Because when people call for equality, democracy, and better conditions for all, then their power, their privilege, their status, and their ownership over the means of production is threatened. And they feel potentially dispossessed of what they feel entitled to. So it's very understandable that people who are in positions of auspicion and power are going to look at left-wing movements as not only threatening, but as victimizing them in a certain way, shape, or form. And that's going to stoke an awful lot of resentment. And I think we need to be cognizant of the psychological dimensions of this when we try to engage in agitation for a more humane kind of society.
Right. And I think one of the ironies of capitalism is that even the capitalist class is oppressed by capitalism. The capitalist class has to follow the logic of capitalism. They have to do what the capitalist class does in capitalism. And if you look at, for example, the super wealthy, they're actually pretty miserable because, as we know, wealth creates happiness up to the point where you're secure, you don't have to worry about the bills too much and everything. But the ultra wealthy are fraught with psychiatric issues. They're extremely depressed and anxious. And so they in a way, they actually are being victimized by capitalism. And that just speaks to how evil capitalism is. We're all suffering under the capitalist system. And so in this last 2 minutes, I was just wondering if you wanted to cover any major takeaways that you want the audience to get from this book that we haven't mentioned yet, maybe.
No, I think that you've done a good job of hitting a lot of the main points. The big thing that I'd want the audience to take away from that is this. You can have whatever thoughts you want on liberal socialism, reject it, hate it, critique it, by all means, right? But I think that we need to acknowledge that an important strand of thought that is rightly called liberal socialism exists. It has had an enormous amount of influence over the course of intellectual history. And I would encourage people to think about what that might mean in terms of being able to form a viable alliance with other progressive or at least non-reactionary forces in society. Right now, the left and liberals are under enormous pressure from very dark reactionary movements. And this isn't even the worst of what a lot of them want. And I think that we need to be all hands on deck in order to counteract that.
All right. That is Professor Matt McManus. Thank you so much for appearing on the podcast.
Yeah, no problem, Landon. Great to talk to you. Bye-bye.